Ever wished you could just teleport across the Atlantic?
Haha. Wouldn't that be something?
Seriously. But, back in the day, Concorde kind of came close. We're talking like under 4 hours from London to New York. Zoom. So today we're strapping ourselves in for a deep dive into this supersonic legend, Concorde, the how, the why, and what the heck they were thinking when they built this thing.
It really is a fascinating story.
No kidding. We've got, get this, declassified memos, flight logs, heck, even blueprints, the whole shebang, all to figure out how Concorde made supersonic travel a reality and why it ultimately failed.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that went into that.
Right. See, Concorde, it wasn't just some, faster plane. It was a whole different beast.
Totally. Completely different design philosophy.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of those differences, shall we?
Let's do it.
Starting with, where else? The wings. Because, let's face it, Concorde's wings, they did not skip leg day.
Haha, that's one way to put it. What we have here is called a slender delta design.
Slender delta.
Yeah, almost triangular, which, that is a far cry from the wings you typically see on, your average Boeing.
Yeah, it's like they looked at a regular plane and said, hold my beer.
Right.
So why the dramatic flare?
It was all about cracking the supersonic code. You see, going that fast, it requires a completely different approach to generating lift.
Lift.
That upward force that keeps a plane in the air.
Right, of course. So we need liftoff, literally. But how do you get those weirdly shaped wings to cooperate at supersonic speeds?
Well, Concorde's engineers, they found a way to almost trick the air.
Trick the air. Okay, I'm listening.
Think of it as creating these mini tornadoes swirling off the edges of those delta wings.
Mini tornadoes on the wings.
Yeah. And that swirling, it generates this incredibly low pressure, which, you guessed it, creates lift.
So aerodynamic magic.
Basically.
Okay, I can dig it. But I gotta say, I'm also picturing a seriously bumpy ride with all those mini tornadoes happening.
Actually, no. Reports from those lucky enough to have flown on Concorde say that, it was remarkably smooth, even at twice the speed of sound.
Okay, that's just showing off. Now, something else that always kind of boggles my mind about supersonic flight is the whole heat thing.
Yeah, the heat is a major factor.
You're basically blasting through the air at insane speeds.
Right.
Doesn't that cause some serious friction?
Absolutely. It's well, think about it like rubbing your hands together really fast.
Okay, getting warmer.
Right. Things heat up.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about Concorde speed, we're not talking about slightly warm. We're talking hundreds of degrees.
Hundreds of degrees. So what, did they make this thing out of some super secret heat resistant material? Vibranium or something?
Well, get this, they used aluminum.
Aluminum, soda can material?
Wow. You're right to be surprised. It was a special high temperature alloy, of course.
Yeah.
But still, aluminum. And even with this special alloy, they had to be really, really careful about how hot Concorde got, which unfortunately, it put a limit on how fast it could ultimately go.
So they're walking this tightrope between lightness, because who wants a heavy plane, and durability. Wait, it gets even wilder. My notes here say that Concorde's fuselage, the main body of the plane, it actually expanded during flight because of the heat.
Yeah. It wasn't just about making Concorde, strong. It had to be flexible, too.
Flexible.
And I mean that literally. They had to design these gaps into the structure to accommodate this, expansion and contraction. Even on the flight deck. Imagine being a passenger and seeing that gap open up mid-flight.
Dude, I probably think we were about to pull a Doctor Who and travel through time or something.
Right.
Speaking of pushing limits, let's talk about the engines that made this whole supersonic dance possible. We're talking 4 Rolls-Royce Snecema Olympus engines.
Those Olympus engines were absolute beasts. Originally designed for bomber, believe it or not.
Wait, they put bomber engines on a passenger jet? Talk about a bold move, but wouldn't that guzzle fuel faster than a college student at a free pizza night?
Well, that's the fascinating part. Concorde only used afterburners, those fuel guzzling devices for extra thrust during takeoff and to break the sound barrier. Once it went supersonic, it was actually surprisingly fuel efficient.
Okay, so efficient for a speed demon at least. This thing was clearly over-engineered in all the best ways, but wasn't flying on Concorde with, 4 bomber engines pushing you through the sound barrier a bit intense.
Perhaps surprisingly, no. It was designed to be remarkably smooth, even at those speeds. But more on the actual experience of flying on Concorde in a bit.
So we've established Concorde, a total marvel of engineering, pushing the boundaries of, what was even possible in aviation at the time. But it wasn't just about the tech, was it? This thing was like a cultural icon.
Oh, absolutely. Flying on Concorde, it wasn't just about, getting from point A to point B quickly. It was an experience, a statement.
Right. I mean, celebrities, royalty, heck, even a pope flew on Concorde.
It really was the ultimate status symbol.
It's like, I've made it, I'm sipping champagne at 60,000 feet and you're not kind of vibe.
Exactly. And the luxury on board? Well, it definitely matched the hype.
Okay, so paint me a picture here. What was it actually like to be a passenger on this supersonic chariot?
Okay, so picture this. Spacious cabins. And I mean spacious.
Not like those sardine cans they stuff us in these days?
No. Designed for comfort. Gourmet meals with fine wines. We're talking like real silverware, not the plastic wrap stuff you get on most flights.
Can you imagine being served caviar at twice the speed of sound? And talk about a life upgrade.
Right.
But this whole dream of, luxury and speed, it came with a hidden cost, one that would ultimately ground this aviation icon.
Yeah, the sonic boom.
Yes.
The earth-shattering caboose.
Not exactly ideal for, a relaxing flight or anyone living below the flight path for that matter.
Yeah, no kidding. So explain that. Why was the sonic boom such a big deal?
So when an aircraft, any aircraft, breaks the sound barrier, it creates this incredibly loud shockwave.
Okay.
It's like a continuous thunderclap, but following the plane.
Following the plane.
Yeah.
Yes, not exactly neighborly.
No, it wasn't.
So no supersonic joyrides over, populated areas then? Not if you wanted to stay on good terms with, well, everyone. This limited Concorde to mostly transatlantic flights, where it could really open up over the ocean.
Right. Which I imagine probably put a bit of a dent in its profitability.
Yeah, that and the cost of actually running this supersonic beast.
Right.
Remember those powerful engines we talked about?
Oh, yeah.
Efficient at supersonic speed, sure, but they still guzzled fuel, especially compared to, newer subsonic jets.
And then there's the maintenance. I mean, keeping a plane that, routinely hit twice the speed of sound in tip-top shape.
Oh, yeah. That wasn't cheap, not in the slightest. Yeah. The economics of Concorde, they just didn't add up.
Right.
And then, well, tragedy struck. Cast a long shadow over its future, really. July 25th, 2000, Air France Flight 4590 crashed shortly after takeoff from Paris.
Yeah, I remember that. A devastating event.
It claimed the lives of everyone on board and some on the ground, too.
Horrible. What happened?
The investigation, they found that debris from another aircraft on the runway had punctured one of Concorde's tires during takeoff.
Oh, wow.
Led to this whole catastrophic chain of events.
Just a freak accident.
Yeah, but obviously with tragic consequences. The public's confidence in Concorde, which was, already a little shaken by the cost and the limited routes and all that.
Yeah.
Well, this really affected it.
It's kind of wild, isn't it?
What's that?
That something as iconic as Concorde, something that seemed, almost invincible,
right,
could be brought down, not by just one thing, but by this whole combination of cost and practicality, and then, of course, that awful tragedy.
Yeah, it really highlights that whole, that complex kind of equation of progress, doesn't it? We get so caught up in the can we of technological innovation.
Right.
That sometimes, the should we and the at what cost.
Yeah.
Kind of gets lost in the excitement.
Totally. So, okay, bottom line time was Concorde a failure?
Oh.
Or was it, as some people say, this bold experiment? It pushed the boundaries of aviation, right? Maybe paved the way for, future innovations down the line.
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, you can't deny it was a total technological marvel.
Oh, yeah.
Concorde proved, without a doubt, that supersonic passenger travel was possible.
Right.
It shrunk the Atlantic. It gave us this glimpse of a future where, distance wasn't this huge barrier.
It was straight out of science fiction. Except it was real. You could literally have breakfast in London, be sipping martinis in New York in time for lunch.
Precisely. And let's not forget about, the incredible engineering that went into it. I mean, those innovative delta wings, the way they tackled the heat issue. Concorde was a testament to, human ingenuity.
It really was the embodiment of that post-war we can do anything spirit, the space race, wow. The belief that, if we set our minds to it, we can achieve anything.
Mm-hmm.
Makes you wonder if we had that same drive today, what other seemingly impossible feats could we, pull off, you know?
It's a fascinating thought experiment, isn't it?
Totally.
But I think we also have to acknowledge that Concorde's legacy is, well, it's a little bittersweet.
How so?
It serves as a reminder that, well, that progress often comes at a price.
Yeah, yeah. The sonic boom, the fuel consumption, the eye-watering operating costs,
Right.
those were all trade-offs. And, well, they ultimately proved to be a bit too much to overcome.
Yeah. And then the tragic accident in 2000 just, it just really underscored the fact that even the most advanced technology, well, it's not without its risks.
For sure. So where does that leave us then? Concorde, she may be gone, but the story continues to fascinate, doesn't it?
It really does. It's both an inspiration and a cautionary tale, I think. A reminder that the pursuit of technological advancement, it's a complex endeavor. There are no easy answers.
So true. And it really begs the question, doesn't it? Like, could a modern Concorde, armed with, all the fancy 21st century technology we've got now, could it overcome those challenges that grounded the original?
It's a great question.
Could we build a supersonic jet that's like quieter, more fuel efficient, maybe even a little more accessible, for those of us who don't have our own private jets?
Well, I mean, there are companies and researchers out there, exploring those possibilities as we speak, looking into new materials, new engine designs, heck, even ways to mitigate that sonic boom.
Can you imagine a world where supersonic travel isn't just some relic of the past, but a real option for more people? Would you take that flight?
In a heartbeat.
Right.
Sign me up.
Right. There's something so undeniably romantic about chasing the sun across the sky at twice the speed of sound. It's a good reminder that, even as we're all grappling with the complexities of the here and now, that human spirit of exploration, that drive to push those boundaries and redefine what's possible, it's still alive and well. So until next time, keep asking those big questions and diving deep, everyone. Okay, so who was the real Saladin? I mean, everyone's heard the name, right? The Sultan, the warrior, almost legendary. But today, let's, really dive into this whole historical icon thing, see if we can find the actual person behind all the stories. We're going deep on Saladin, and trust me, the truth is way more interesting than any legend.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, his life, it's romanticized like crazy, especially here in the West, right? So we got to peel back some of that, see the complicated stuff, what drove him, what really made the guy tick. And the wild part is this isn't just dusty old history. It matters for how we see things even now, surprisingly.
For real. So got to start somewhere, right? Might as well be the ultimate rabbit hole, Wikipedia.
Right.
Now, before you click away thinking it's boring, hear me out. Wikipedia is perfect to get started. Gives us the broad stroke, sets the scene, then we can really get into the good stuff.
100%. Got to have that foundation, especially with someone like Saladin. I mean, this isn't just a guy famous for winning battles, right? He's admired for his character, how he led. That's the paradox we're going to unpack.
Exactly. And get this, Saladin, right? Sultan, conqueror, the name that practically screams Middle East, wasn't even born in the region we usually picture. Dude was born in Tikrit, which, and this blew my mind, is in modern-day Iraq. Not what I was expecting.
It really shows how different things were back then, borders, even how people saw themselves. And it gets more complex. Saladin wasn't Arab, he was Kurdish. And that's huge G-E. See, Kurdish identity back then, way different than how some people see it now, more unified. It adds a whole other layer to who he was loyal to, what he wanted to achieve.
Speaking of ambition, his dad was a mercenary. That's some straight-up movie material. You can almost picture little Saladin watching, learning about strategy, loyalty, maybe even getting a taste for, power itself,
You're totally on point.
Yeah.
That upbringing, it wasn't just about fighting and stuff. It was like boot camp for a world where power was always up for grabs. It made Saladin practical, Yeah. He learned how to make alliances, how to survive when everything's chaotic, and you can see that playing out his whole life.
You know what else is interesting they mentioned? That Saladin knew the Quran super well and all this, sciences of religion stuff. But then there's this bit about him memorizing this epic poem, the Hamasa. Was that just him showing off, hey, everyone, look how smart I am?
Oh, it's way deeper than that. Got to remember what culture was like back then. The Hamasa, for anyone who doesn't know, it's this huge collection of Arabic poetry, almost like their version of a values and history book, Poetry wasn't just pretty words, it was power. Think political messages, rallying cries, even a way to connect with people on a, soul level. Saladin memorizing that. Total power move. Proved he understood their culture, their history, on a deeper level.
Whoa. That puts a whole new spin on things, makes you realize how much we miss when we look at history just on the surface.
Exactly. And speaking of looking closer, let's talk about how Saladin actually ruled. Because here's this guy, praised for being pious, loving the Quran. But then there's this other side. He could be absolutely ruthless when he had to be. They even mentioned he had some Sufi leaders executed. It's complicated, right?
Yeah, it makes you think, how does that fit with the whole pious, merciful sultan thing? It's not something you hear about too often.
And that's the whole point. We can't just slap these good guy, bad guy labels on history. Got to remember, this was completely crazy times. Crusades were raging, everyone wanted power, and Saladin, like any leader back then, he had to make tough calls, even brutal ones, to keep things from falling apart and get what he wanted.
Easy to judge from where we are now, centuries later. But back then, sounds like ruthlessness was practically in the job description.
Totally. And this is where understanding his past is so key. Remember his dad, the mercenary. That upbringing taught Saladin to be practical above all else. He got that sometimes. You got to do hard things, even things that feel wrong, to protect your people, to make the bigger play.
Which brings us to, the most movie-esque chapter. Assassination attempts by the assassins. Talk about a stressful work environment having a target on your back 24/7.
No kidding. The assassins were the real deal, shrouded in mystery, incredibly effective. But get this, those attempts on his life, they didn't just make Saladin super careful, they forced him to make some unlikely alliances. Later on, he realizes, hey, he's got a common enemy with the assassins, the Crusaders. So what does he do? Puts aside the whole revenge thing, tries to work with them. Talk about pragmatism.
That's some next-level strategic thinking. Really makes you wonder, if Saladin was around now, what kind of leader would he be? Cutthroat politician, CEO.
Honestly. He'd probably kill it in anything that needed strategy, diplomacy, thinking 10 steps ahead. But let's not forget, Saladin wasn't just a brilliant strategist. He was a man of deep faith. And this is where capturing Jerusalem takes on a whole other meaning. Because instead of the usual bloodbath, the revenge thing that was totally normal back then, Saladin did something incredible. He showed restraint.
Seriously, it's almost hard to believe. After a victory that intense, he let the Crusaders walk peacefully, even let them pay ransom to get out of there. That's the opposite of how brutal things usually were.
Exactly. And that is where that whole Saladin, the chivalrous, Saladin, the merciful image starts to appear. Think about it. He could have just slaughtered them all, taken everything, and enslaved the survivors. But he chose a different way, a way that focused on justice, even compassion, even for the guys he just beat in a war.
And then there's the part where he lets Jewish people resettle in Jerusalem. That was basically unheard of in those times. Makes you realize Saladin wasn't just a product of his time, he was a leader who actually broke the mold, did things his own way.
Super important point. It forces us to rethink those simple stories we get told about history, the ones that are often just plain wrong. Saladin was a walking contradiction, a complex guy who could be ruthless, ain't compassionate, a brilliant strategist, ain't a spiritual person. He doesn't fit in a box, and that's what makes studying him so fascinating.
It's definitely a far cry from those one-dimensional history book versions. So with Jerusalem back in his control, did Saladin just, retire to a life of luxury, or were there more battles, more challenges that shaped his later years?
Well, Jerusalem was a huge win. But the story wasn't over yet. The Crusades kept going, and Saladin found himself facing a new challenge, Richard the Lionheart. And this is where his whole multifaceted character really comes out. He wasn't just dealing with Richard's military skills. He was playing the diplomacy game, building alliances, even engaging in acts of, personal chivalry that turned him into the legend we know today.
And Jerusalem, it wasn't just about the land itself, right? It was this huge symbol, something everyone wanted. Taking it back, that had to be about more than just winning on a map.
100%. Jerusalem was massively important, religiously, symbolically. For Saladin, it wasn't just about getting a city back. It was like reclaiming the heart and soul of the Islamic world. And the way he went about it, breaking those truces, the pure strategy at the Battle of Hattin, it all shows how deeply he believed in this.
Speaking of Hattin, that's always called this ultimate victory for Saladin. What made his plan so good? Was he just that much better at fighting, or was there something else going on?
Well, he was definitely no slouch on the battlefield, let's be real. But the real genius at Hattin, it was how Saladin used strategy A&D, a deep understanding of, the Crusaders' minds. He used their weaknesses, their arrogance, even the fact that they weren't totally united. It's like He was playing chess, and they were still figuring out checkers, you know.
That's wild. So it wasn't just about being stronger. It was about outsmarting them completely. Makes you think, what if Saladin was around now? What would that guy be doing? Politics, some big-time CEO making power moves.
Oh, he'd be running the show somewhere, that's for sure. Anything that needed strategy, talking your way in or out of things, thinking 10 steps ahead, that was Saladin's jam. But we got to remember, this wasn't just some cold, calculating mastermind. He was deeply faithful. And that's where taking Jerusalem gets really interesting. Because instead of the massacre everyone expected, the revenge thing, Saladin did something pretty much unheard of.
Right. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. After a fight like that, most rulers would have gone all scorched earth. But he just let them go. The defeated crusaders just walked away peacefully. He even let them pay a ransom to get out of there. That's not exactly how the rulebook usually worked.
Nope, not at all. And that is where this whole Saladin, the chivalrous thing really starts. He could have taken everything, everyone, made them slaves. But he went another way. Justice, compassion. Even for the guys he just beat in a war. That's different.
And then on top of that, he lets Jewish people back into Jerusalem to resettle. You said it yourself, that was practically forbidden back then. It's like more proof that Saladin wasn't just playing by his time period's rules, he was making his own.
100%. It makes you question those simple stories we get told, you know. Saladin was full of contradictions, tough, A&E compassionate, a genius strategist, but also deeply spiritual. He doesn't fit neatly anywhere, and that's what makes studying him so interesting. Way more interesting than some boring history book version, that's for sure. So Jerusalem's back, Saladin's won. Did he just, like, retire to a life of luxury? Or were there more fights, more things that shaped him later on?
Oh, Jerusalem was huge, but it wasn't the end. The Crusades weren't over, not even close. Saladin found himself up against a whole new challenge, Richard the Lionheart. And this is where we really see all those different sides of him come out. It wasn't just armies clashing. It was Saladin juggling military stuff with diplomacy, alliances, even those acts of, like, personal chivalry that made him a legend.
Richard the Lionheart. I mean, talk about an epic showdown. It's like something right out of those poems Saladin loved. What was their deal? Like, did they actually respect each other, even while they were busy trying to outsmart each other? You nailed it. Outsmart is the right word. Their whole relationship is fascinating. You had these huge battles, obviously, but there's this undercurrent of, I don't know, like professional respect going on, too. Richard, even though they were fighting, he admired how good Saladin was at, well, everything, the military stuff, that chivalry thing. There's even stories about Saladin sending Richard gifts, even medicine, when he got sick.
No way. See, that's what I'm talking about. Adds to the whole chivalrous image, right? Even in the middle of a war, the guy's thinking about his enemy's well-being.
It's true. And remember earlier, we were saying how Saladin's image, especially in the West, got kind of romanticized over time. Those stories about him and Richard, the respect, the generosity, that's huge GE for how that image got built.
Yeah.
Writers, especially those romantic era guys, they ate that stuff up.
It's like that game Telephone, but with history. The further you get from the source, the more the story changes, gets more and more dramatic.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Even with some exaggeration, even if we're seeing him through rose-colored glasses a bit, Saladin left a mark, you can't deny it. It wasn't just about conquering. He changed things, brought Muslims together. And his choices, they echoed way beyond his own lifetime.
Makes you wonder, what would a guy like that think about the world in W? How would he handle all the crazy geopolitics and stuff?
Now, there's a thought. And I don't know if we can really know, but his story gives us some clues, you know? Saladin could bridge those divides, find common ground with people he completely disagreed with. That's something we could use a lot more of these days, don't you think?
It's like you said at the beginning, Saladin's story isn't just some history lesson, it's about understanding right now. He makes us think harder, go beyond the simple stories, really wrestle with how complex history, and honestly, everything really is.
Couldn't put it better myself. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Saladin's world, got to remember, this is just scratching the surface. There's so much more out there to explore, more stories to find.
That's the best part about history, right? It's not dead and gone. It's an ongoing conversation, always something new to learn.
Absolutely. It's about asking questions, questioning what you think you know, and being open to seeing things in totally new ways.
Well said. And to everyone listening, don't stop digging. You never know what amazing things you'll discover. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Saladin.
Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into a book that's considered, well, really the bedrock of modern economics, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You've sent us some really interesting excerpts from Wikipedia about it, and I have to admit, even for someone who's, not an economist, this book is clearly a big deal. Thankfully, we have an expert with us today to help break it all down.
It's great to be here. You're absolutely right. The Wealth of Nations is considered fundamental to classical economics. Even today, Smith's ideas about, things like the division of labor, free markets, and the role of government are still actively debated.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah.
Smith was writing this in 1776. That's like right when America was declaring its independence.
Right.
I wonder how much influence his ideas had on that whole period and the way America's economy developed.
That's a very astute observation. And you're right, the timing is significant. The Wealth of Nations was very much a product of its time, written during a period of, immense economic and social upheaval. Remember, Smith was witnessing the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution.
So before we get too far, let's provide some context for our listeners. The excerpts you sent mentioned that Smith was really critical of something called mercantilism, which was like the dominant economic system of his day. Can you remind us what that was all about and why Smith had such a problem with it?
Absolutely. Mercantilism, in a nutshell, was all about nations trying to hoard wealth, specifically gold and silver. They believed that a country's wealth was finite and that the only way to become richer was to have more gold than everyone else. This led to policies focused on, exporting goods to get that gold and putting up barriers like tariffs to prevent other nations from doing the same.
Ah, okay. So basically it was like a giant economic competition where everyone was trying to outmaneuver each other.
Exactly. And this is where Smith comes in with his kind of radical new ideas. He argued that this constant battle for a bigger piece of a supposedly fixed pie was actually incredibly harmful, and that true wealth wasn't about hoarding gold, but about increasing productivity and trade. This is where his concept of the invisible hand comes into play. He believed that when individuals are free to pursue their own economic interests in a competitive market, they unintentionally benefit society as a whole. It's as if an invisible hand is guiding them toward a positive outcome.
Okay, I see where you're going with this, but I have to admit the idea that pursuing self-interest can somehow lead to a greater good still feels a little, counterintuitive. What's the logic there?
It is a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Smith argued that when individuals are free to innovate, produce goods and services that others want, and compete in a fair market, it ultimately leads to greater efficiency, a wider variety of goods and services, and lower prices for everyone. Essentially, everyone pursuing their own self-interest in this free market system ends up creating a system that, while not perfect, is beneficial to society as a whole.
So it's not that self-interest is inherently good, but rather that it can, within the right framework, become a driving force for progress.
Exactly. It's important to remember that Smith wasn't advocating for an anything-goes approach. He recognized the need for ethical behavior, fair competition, and, importantly, government regulation.
Now, that's what I was hoping we'd get to, because I was reading about Smith's views on the government's role, and it doesn't sound like he was advocating for a completely hands-off approach.
You're absolutely right. He believed that while the invisible hand could work its magic in a free market, the government had a crucial role in creating the conditions for that market to function properly.
So what did he see as the government's primary responsibilities in all this?
Well, for one, he believed the government was responsible for preventing monopolies.
Okay.
Because if one company corners the market, it distorts the whole system of competition that allows the invisible hand to work in the first place.
That makes sense.
What else?
Well, he also believed in things like public education and infrastructure projects.
Right.
Even if these weren't directly profitable ventures for private businesses, he saw them as essential for a thriving society. It's fascinating how these ideas from centuries ago still resonate with the debates we're having today. But let's get back to this idea of self-interest as a driving force in the economy.
Yeah.
How exactly did Smith envision this invisible hand playing out in a practical sense?
That's where his concept of division of labor becomes crucial. In fact, he devotes the very first chapter of The Wealth of Nations to this idea.
Division of labor.
Yeah.
Okay. Remind us what that means again. Is it like when people specialize in a specific task or craft?
Precisely. Smith argued that when people specialize in specific tasks, instead of trying to do everything themselves, it leads to a significant boost in overall productivity.
Intuitively, that makes sense. If you have people focusing on what they're best at, the output is bound to be, better, right?
Exactly. And to illustrate this point, Smith uses a very memorable example in The Wealth of Nations, the pin factory.
Okay, a pin factory. I'm intrigued. What's so special about making pins?
Well, Smith argues that if one person were to try and make an entire pin by themselves, from start to finish, they'd be lucky to make even a single pin in a day.
Yeah.
But if you break down the process of pin making into, smaller, more specialized tasks, drawing the wire, straightening it, cutting it, sharpening it, and so on, and then you have different people in the factory each specializing in one of those specific tasks, well, then the output increases dramatically.
So instead of one person doing everything, you have a whole team of specialists each, like, handling a specific part of the process.
Yeah.
Makes sense to me. Does Smith, quantify how much more efficient this approach would be?
He did. Smith claimed that in workshops where this division of labor was implemented, 10 workers could produce 48,000 pins per day.
48,000?
Yeah.
Wow, that's quite a compelling argument for specialization. But how does this pin factory example connect to the larger economy?
That's a great question. Smith believed that this principle of the division of labor applied not just to pin factories, but to all sorts of industries and to society as a whole. When individuals are able to specialize in a particular area and become very, very good at that one thing, and then they trade their specialized goods or services with others who've also specialized in their own areas, it creates a more prosperous system for everyone. This leads to a greater abundance of goods and services available to everyone at lower costs.
So this specialization, this division of labor, it's all about enabling that invisible hand to do its work, to guide the market towards greater efficiency and wealth creation. It's interesting to see how Smith connects all these ideas. But didn't he also have some, reservations about this system?
You're right to pick up on that. While Smith was a huge proponent of the division of labor, he wasn't blind to its potential downsides.
What kind of downsides?
Well, he worried that if workers were forced to perform the same simple task day in and day out, it could lead to a sort of mental and intellectual stagnation. He even wrote that it could make them as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become.
That's a bit of a sobering thought. It sounds like he's anticipating some of the criticisms that emerged during the Industrial Revolution, about the dehumanizing aspects of factory work.
Precisely. Smith recognized that while specialization was key to economic progress, it also had the potential to be detrimental to the human spirit if taken to an extreme. He believed that a society solely focused on profit and efficiency could, end up harming itself.
So what was his solution? Did he offer any ideas on how to mitigate these negative consequences?
He did. This is where his views on the role of government come back into play. Remember how we talked about his support for public education?
Yes, he saw it as a crucial responsibility of the government, even if it wasn't immediately profitable.
Exactly. He believed that a well-educated populace was essential for a healthy society and that it could help counteract some of the potentially stultifying effects of the division of labor. He also advocated for things like the arts and sciences, which he saw as vital for, human flourishing, even if they weren't always directly aligned with market forces.
So for Smith, a truly prosperous society wasn't just about maximizing economic output. It was also about cultivating a sense of shared purpose, intellectual curiosity, and moral responsibility.
Absolutely. Smith believed that a balanced approach was needed, one that harnessed the power of free markets and the dynamism of the division of labor, while also recognizing the importance of ethical considerations and the need for a government that protected the common good.
It's incredible how relevant these ideas still feel today. It really makes you wonder what Smith would think of today's world. I mean, here we are centuries later dealing with globalization, automation, these massive tech companies. It's like we're living in a whole new era of economic complexity.
You're absolutely right. The world has changed dramatically since Smith's time.
Right.
But that's what makes his work so fascinating to revisit. His insights into human behavior, markets, and the role of government still offer valuable points of reflection, even in today's complex global economy.
So put yourself in Adam Smith's shoes for a moment. What do you think he would say about the economic landscape of the 21st century?
Well, knowing what we do about his views on monopolies, he likely have some strong opinions about today's multinational corporations. He was deeply skeptical of, concentrated power and the undue influence of special interest groups, which he believed could distort markets and ultimately harm the public good.
So he'd probably be calling for more regulation of big tech, maybe pushing for stronger antitrust laws?
It's certainly possible. He might argue that while these companies have undoubtedly spurred innovation and brought many benefits benefits to consumers. They also have a responsibility to operate ethically and within a framework of fair competition.
Yeah.
He might even suggest that their immense size and influence require updated regulations to ensure a level playing field for smaller businesses and to protect the interests of consumers.
It's a fascinating thought experiment, isn't it? To imagine how thinkers from the past would react to the challenges of our time. And speaking of challenges, what about Smith's thoughts on free trade? He was a huge proponent of it back then, but the world is a very different place. Do you think his arguments still hold up in today's globalized economy with all its complexities?
That's a question that still sparks heated debate among economists to this day.
Yeah.
Smith passionately believed in the power of free trade to lift nations out of poverty and create greater prosperity for everyone involved.
Right?
He'd likely be amazed by the sheer scale and intricacy of global commerce today. But he was also keenly aware of the potential pitfalls of economic systems, particularly when left unchecked.
So he might have some concerns about things like worker exploitation in developing countries or the environmental impact of global supply chains.
Exactly. He might argue that while free trade can be a powerful engine for growth, it needs to be managed carefully with an eye towards social responsibility and sustainability. He'd likely advocate for international agreements that ensure fair labor practices, environmental protections, and a more equitable distribution of the benefits of globalization.
It's incredible to think that a book written nearly 250 years ago can still feel so relevant, so full of insights that resonate with the issues of our time.
It's a testament to the enduring power of Smith's ideas and his ability to identify these fundamental tensions that exist within any economic system. He grappled with these big questions about human nature, the organization of society, and the creation of wealth in a way that continues to challenge and inspire us today.
This deep dive has really given me a whole new perspective on things. I'm starting to see the world through a different lens, one that's more attuned to the complexities of the market, the role of government, and even the implications of my own choices as a consumer. It's a lot to process.
That's the beauty of engaging with these foundational texts. They push us to think critically, question assumptions, and consider different perspectives.
I have a feeling this is just the beginning of my journey down the rabbit hole of economics. There's so much more to learn and explore.
There certainly is, but that's the exciting part, isn't it? Each question we answer only leads to more questions, and the pursuit of knowledge becomes a lifelong adventure.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the wealth of nations. It's been incredibly enlightening.
The pleasure was all mine. Always happy to discuss Adam Smith and his enduring legacy. Until next time.